So, good evening, everyone. Today, we are students of the National Law School. As editors and observers of the Law School Policy Review, we're here to interview Professor Sandipto Dasgupta on his book Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Post-Colony. Professor Dasgupta, before we begin with the podcast, how would you feel that the book has changed the narrative on how post-colonial constitutionalism has emerged since it was published?
Hi, thank you for having me, first of all. I don't know if it has changed the narrative yet, or if it will. One book is not enough for these things. But the attempt, where you're right, was to do something of that kind. I think since I was a law student, years back. I mean, I would say broadly since the late 1980s, there has been this kind of one way of thinking about constitutions, in more globally, but as well as in the post-colonial world, which is sort of has been as an extension of the model of the American Constitution. As I think of it as a sort of set of some kinds of desirable norms, which is sort of has this the given template, which each country should try to adopt some version of, and to sort of think of constitutionalism or the spread of global constitutionalism as the kind of more progressive adoption of these norms across the world, right? And these norms are, in that sense, therefore, independent of the particular social, historical, or political context of those countries. Right. And I think my attempt was to go back or draw from another sort of tradition of constitutionalism, which I think is, sort of goes back to the Second World War before that as well, which I think is more relevant to the case of India, or understanding how the Indian constitution was made and how it's supposed to function, is to go to think of it as an extension, as a result or a product of the anti-colonial political struggle, right? So it's a result of a particular political struggle informed by that struggle, right? And then so the process of making institutions or institutionalizing the gains of that struggle, right? And building a new kind of political reality based on that, right? So it's a different way of thinking, either as a template of norms, which are often derived from American Constitution or American constitutional studies, and the other is thinking of it as part of this longer historical process, right? So that's been my attempt to sort of move from one to the other. And I think constitutional theory or constitutional studies, as you might know as well as law students, are very much informed by this first Americanized model, even in India, very much so in India, I would argue, and very much across the world. And so this was sort of an attempt at trying to think of it in another way, right? And I'm part of a larger, sort of growing group of still, minority in the academy, scholars who try to do this other way of thinking about constitutions.
That's a very interesting way of looking at things. So when we begin with the title, legalizing the revolution, doesn't the title suggests a very inherent paradox. Revolutions aren't
Right,
something which are recognized by states. So in the
right.
era surrounding the time in which the book deals with this concept, how would you feel that the phrase legalizing the revolution emerged in India and what its origins were?
Right. So it's a phrase, it's of course not a phrase that people then talk about. It's a phrase I kind of try to give to it. And it was, I think for me, it began with this sort of, you can think of, I wanted to work on the Indian Constitution, right? And that was sort of, and I wanted to work on it, as I said, a bit differently. Not so much just to think about, what are the principle A, principle B, principle C, how has the courts looked at it kind of way, a juridical way, but to think of it, as I said, as a part of this large historical process following the anti-colonial, of what we call the independence movement. And in doing that, I kind of realized that in the Constant Assembly debates, right, there is a lot of talk and a lot of use of the word revolution, right? And this is not something we would normally imagine to be the case, right? I mean, all of you are students of Indian history and in politics, you know that we never talk about our independence movement as a revolution, right? Congress doesn't call themselves revolutionaries. Like, this is not a term which is widely used in India, yet they talk about that a lot in the Constitution, right? And there is the revolution sort of appears, I think, in the Constituent Assembly as very much, as this, as I say in the book, as there's two possible versions, right? Either you can have a revolution as in kind of this, the way we understand revolutions as such an unruly, untidy eruption of events, right? Something you can't control, something you can't really predict. And that would change a lot about it, and it can come as they fear from the unrest of the masses who are still upset about things haven't changed enough after independence. There hasn't been enough equality, there's not enough freedom for people, and then they say therefore to sort of kind of preempt that, to stop that kind of revolution, we need another way of thinking of revolution, right? And so if the first kind of revolution is the way we think about revolution, sort of these um, unruly sort of momentous events, the way people think about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. The other is the way you can think about something more sort of a planned way of doing massive social change. The way often we think about revolutionary technology or something like that, right? The way say something which has changed a lot, but not in a way which has caused mass unrest, right? And so they start thinking about, can we do a revolution in that form where we can make major changes in society, right? Where we kind of address some of these concerns about economic inequality, lack of growth, stagnancy, oppression, and so on, right? And that was the process which I think, and then they talk a lot in the assembly about these two forms of revolutions. How would you do the second kind of revolution, the managed revolution, to stop the first kind from happening, right? And so that's the kind of revolution I realize is what they want to do through law. So the law and the constitution then becomes kind of a mode, right? An instrument, a form in which this second kind of revolution can be achieved, right? And so that's where I kind of realized that the one way of therefore kind of in a short, pithy way of representing this task, this ambition, which I think was the central ambition for the constitution makers, was to legalize the revolution, right? In other words, say, okay, can we do this huge, ambitious social change? The project will come to be known as planning, development. We all know these terms in the first 10, 20 years of Indian history, right? It's attempts at doing land reform, industrialization, public sector industrialization, nationalizing industries, right? Creating this huge, new kind of companies and company towns, and all of this can be under this sort of attempt, and doing it not outside the constitution, not on the streets, right? Not through unrest and unruliness, but through careful planning by actors of the state, very much within and through the constitution. And so that for me was therefore the central motive of the constitution for me, was that of legalizing revolution. And just to sort of go back to your earlier question, that's the contrast with other ways to think about the constitution, right? It's about limited government or rights. That's often how we think what is the central core sort of project of constitutionalism is. And for me, it was this, some way to domesticate, to legalize this attempt at massive social change.
So, regarding the point of introducing social change, on page 10 of your book, you introduce the concept of transformational constitutionalism. Given the idea that at that point, constitutionalism was first emerged as writing down the ideals and principles on which a nation shall exist, how do you feel revolutions exist with transformative constitutionalism then and now?
So you're saying, are you asking whether like transformational constitution is still a relevant way in which we think about social change, or?
Yes, today and in the era in which this book deals with.
Right, right. So I think to me, once I sort of, and again, that as I say in the book in introduction, to which part you're quoting from, like that's a term again which comes to me from the assembly debate itself. It's not necessarily a term I want to impose on it, because they keep talking about this idea of can we do transformation, but without sort of destabilizing the order, right? So just what I kind of gave a sense of. So what's interesting about that is there is this other idea of constitutionalism, which I said comes from the American tradition and a bit from the British tradition as well. But which, and I was saying, is the dominant way in which we think about constitutions today, really, right? Especially the last 30, 40 years, very much the only way we think of constitution, more or less, is constitutions are meant to create limits and order. Right, those are two main terms. If you think about, like, give me two terms which comes to mind immediately when you say the word constitution, are these two terms, right? Constitution are meant to sort of limit what the state can do, the government can do, right, and create some kind of an order, a system within which we can all function. We know, right. Well, what is fascinating about the Indian constitutional project, and I argue in the book, I think more broadly, most of these newly independent countries around this time after the Second World War, which are coming into being, I think for most of them, constitution, the main principle around which they want to build a constitutional structure is not limit, but change, right? As I just said, right? And so it's, in other words, their idea of constitutionalism, or what we see, think about, what can a constitution do or what should it do, right, is not really, the starting point is not limiting things, but to change things, right? Transformational things. And so I think that gives us, if you start from that, that is such a big distinction, right, between limits and change, that the idea of constitution, the whole structure which follows from that, is quite distinctive, right? And something we really think about as a distinctive category of constitutions. And so that category is what I want to call transformational constitutionalism, which is a constitutional structure which develops if your starting point, right, your first principle is that of change, controlled change, gradual change, change within law, but change, right? And what happens to a constitutional structure then? What happens to a constitutional legal principles or institutions, right? How we think about the interactions of them. And that's the second half of the book, is really trying to think, okay, this institution that we kind of very familiar with, things about like rights, right? Things about courts, things like property, things like the parliament. How does all of those familiar versions we get from, let's say, this sort of dominant American constitutional model actually change, right? How do we rethink those institutions if we think of them from the starting point of transformation rather than limit?
So, when we talk about change, 3 pages later
Right,
on, page number 13, you introduce the point of land reforms being calculated by the state, which did
right.
not, which actually culminated in the change of social order without a revolution, without the bloodshed. So,
Mm-hmm.
considering that we usually consider constitutionalism to emerge out of the state from a top down approach, why was it that
Mm-hmm.
land reforms went uncontested in this form of constitutionalism?
So I don't think, the land reform story, which I have in more in detail in the chapter 7, the property chapter, right? Um, I don't think it's necessarily a success in India, and I think this is not just me thinking. There's a whole literature in social science which says, what are the limits of land reform. The important point about land reform, however, is that is something that is very, very much part of the Congress proposal from 1930s onward. It's something they have to do. And they have to do land reform to understand this, not just because of, because they're like good people or they're sort of, just benevolent. Land reforms are fundamental for two very important reasons, right? One, because under the British system, like you have this large, especially in North India, you have these large zamindaris, right? And these like massive landlords who are generally agreed by most people to be deeply unproductive, right? So in other words, these are not kind of entrepreneurial farmers who invest in the land and to increase the productivity and think of new crops. These are people who are just don't even live in the villages, often live in the cities, just kind of just take the rent out of the land and they don't invest in anything. This all they care about is how much they can squeeze out from the peasants, right? So that's one problem and problem of actually economic growth. And this is again a worldwide phenomenon. Right? Every major country, like think about in Asia, like Japan or Korea, which had its economic growth, China had a land reform first, because you have to sort of, cannot have good economic growth with these sort of unproductive landlords. So that's one major concern. All of them follow, right? Like that's just something you see very much 30s onwards. Even like people who are not like say socialists, like capitalists, like the Bombay Plan and so on, talks about land reform, right? This is by the major industrialists in Bombay. So it's very important for that reason. The other reason is a more of a reason of equality, right? Because of course the land system, the peasant system in India was deeply, deeply oppressive. And as you can know, so if you read these novels by these sort of famous writers, I cite some of them in the book. People like Premchand or Manik Bandyopadhyay, you could really see how oppressive the village conditions were vis-a-vis the landlord and the peasants, and how much the nationalist movement took note of that, right? And from very early on, you would see this in the Congress, from the sort of the 20s onwards, talk about how landlordism is a problem for India and how the peasants have to be liberated from that. So both on the point about economic growth and on the point of equality, land reform was one of perhaps the most important, single most important policy question for the new governments. Again, this is just not in India. I think it's more broadly because it's a very similar kind of problem across the colonial world, right? So that's the concern. Now the question then, but what we have is that we have, if you should go back to our broad framework of transformational constitutionalism, you have to now do this land reform through legal and constitutional means. You just can't have a peasant rebellion. You can't just go away and burn down the house of landlords and take away all their land. It's kind of the idea that the imagination of peasant rebellions are, but you have to do it some legal way, right? And that's why in the Constituent Assembly, land reform is perhaps one of the most longest discussed policy issues, I would say. And the property question, which follows from that, so the articles on property, Article 31 at that time, becomes the longest discussed article. I think it is about it's a 3.5 year long process of drafting that. It's one of the most, and you can imagine, because always questions of money and property are the ones people debate the most because there's most at stake there in some senses, right? And also all the new Congress ministries came into place are passing land reform acts at that time. Right? And the first major constitutional challenge, first major judicial challenge to the Constitution is on the question of land reform, right? It's a very, very early challenge, which is sort of, the Kameshwar Singh case in the Bihar High Court is on land reform. And that's literally the 2 months after the Constitution is passed, right? In the March of 1950, you have the court striking down a law based on the Constitution, and this on land reform. All the major litigation on the most significant, most contentious litigation on the Constitution will be on land reform, right? So land reform for me, this is not something we think a lot when we teach in constitutional law classes. We sort of don't make this a major issue. Again, we think in terms of fundamental rights and division, separation of power and judicial review, but land reform perhaps was the single most contentious issue, right? Both politically at that time, right, and framing of the Constitution, right? It really shaped the Constitution in a fundamental way. Like, you just go and search for land or land reform in the system debates, you get multiple references to it, right? People are talking about it all the time. And so I wanted to sort of bring that in. Now the question you say from that, and that's how, in my view, land reform affects Indian Constitution enormously, and again, something we don't always recognize, right? And it's not necessarily something which I would say is from below, right? Land reform, actually, the way of doing it from below would be through this peasant rebellion way, right? Which is all the farm peasants in different parts, or something would happen in Telangana, for example, while the Constitution was ruined, right? In Telangana, peasant revolt was that peasants sort of took up arms, took away the land of landlords, and did land reform their way. They want to avoid that, and to avoid that, they want to actually do a very disciplined form of land reform from above through the Constitution, right? Through all these land reform laws. You have all these UP land reform law, Bengal land reform law, Madras land reform law. These are all these laws, right, which are trying to do it actually from above. So that, and the below above is another way of thinking of these two revolutions, right? The most unruly revolutions, uncontrolled revolution, versus this gradual planned transformation.
So at the same time, as you mentioned, the impact of other countries and other post-colonial interventions happening around across the world, where newly decolonized countries were beginning to form their own constitution. At the same time, the Cold War was also taking place. So how would you feel? I think you've mentioned it in your book in the first half somewhere, that the Cold War was influencing the ideals of how comparative post-colonialism is emerging vis-a-vis to constitutionalism. So how would you remark its impact on land reforms, and secondly, Indian colonial studies?
So I think this is a very important thing. Again, something which we only beginning to sort of study properly now, like how important Cold War was in so in a couple of ways. Cold War was actually very important as an actual thing. So especially if you look at the process of decolonization in Africa, right? Cold War was an actual thing. People like America and so was meddling in these countries. Governments are being overthrown. You can think of places like Iran, or Congo, right? People assassinated, proxy wars being fought. India, because it's a big enough country, strong at this point, and non-land survey, didn't really have any of that. So we didn't really have an actual political problem because of Cold War, till something like as close to the Bangladesh war, when we have sort of get caught up in that a little bit. But Indian political system is not affected by that. So there are not kind of interventions in it. So we don't have that problem. What we do have, nevertheless, is I think, which is why it's hard to sort of discern that in India, is there are ideological framings which come from the Cold War, right? And that really, really inform and shape the way we think about the things. And I think we don't always see that as a Cold War fact. But I think what Cold War did, I think quite tragically for these newly independent countries, it kind of, cut short their creativity, right? So you kind of had to take one or the other side. Often you didn't even have one to, right? There are many countries who necessarily were not communists, who had to kind of go to the Soviet Union because America was interested in something else, right? So you kind of had to make this choice, and you had to do system A versus system B. While the kind of thing I want to capture in the book, that this sort of newer, distinctive kind of creative attempt, right, at creating post-colonial institutions, that path was really shortened and really kind of and you often you were made to believe that either you're side this side or that side, and then there'll be a coup, there'll be an overthrow, and so on, right? And that's the thing, the deep tragedy of Cold War for these newly independent countries. It really kind of curtailed their creativity. As I said, that didn't really happen in India too much, but there was an effect of that, right? And ideologically, I think what it did, therefore, is to think of, you either thought about constitutionalism in the liberal American way, right? Or you were in the side of communism, and for unfreedom. So, in other words, to be considered a member of what was called the free world, you have to think of constitutions in this idea of a limited government, all of the sort of American rights sort of thing, right? And I think that became part of the story where what I was saying earlier, that constitutions understood this is a very narrow template, like something which is either you kind of buy that whole package like that, or you don't have constitutional limit at all, right? I think that kind of a very simplified binary choice of what constitutions are is very much a Cold War product, right? Where the American side, the free world, was associated with a particular idea of what constitutions are, right? And much more, I think, as importantly for us, because we are, thinkers, scholars of constitution, constitutional scholarship was very, very much affected by this. Right? You get, I cite some literature from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, right, where everybody's saying, this is what constitutions are, and if you don't buy this, you are on the other side of the Cold War, right? And there's a very, if those of you interested, there's a very, very good book on this, a large, big but good book by a friend of mine called Aziz Rana, who is a professor of law here in the US, in Boston. And his book basically shows how the beginners of America, what he called the American Empire after the war, right, is very much associated with this particular idea of constitution. So constitutionalism or constitution is very much one of the main sort of pillars of rising American power, and that's how it gets caught up in the Cold War very fundamentally. And again, something I think we're only now fully unpacking.
So at the same time, I find it very ironical that both sides of the Cold War countries, both the US and the USSR, emerged through revolutions enshrining the
Right.
ideals of both popular sovereignty as well as economic sovereignty. Given that we didn't have a revolution which was considerably consolidated around the points of popular and economic sovereignty, how would you feel the Indian constitution has brought in these ideals, regardless of how the Cold War has impacted
The
colonialism
ideals
and
of economic and
constitutions?
popular sovereignty.
Exactly.
Right. So, I mean, the thing is, I think the Soviet Union or the United States, the American and the Russian Revolution, right, are not necessarily on those kind of questions. They have their own, because they're a different moment, really, right? So one is, really about sort of communism, and the other is kind of about sort of secession from the British Empire and about self-government in a different way. The questions of popular and economic sovereignty are very much questions of what you can call anti-colonial movements, right? So when you have the European empires, former European empires, especially in Asia and Africa, right, almost all parts of Asia and Africa, with some very minor exceptions, right, like say Japan or something, were under colonial rule, either directly in the case of India, or indirectly, like China, right? And so the main kind of two goals these countries have when they want, what we call independence or freedom from empire, is, political and then economic sovereignty. So political sovereignty, of course, will be understood as, which is the easier one in some senses, right? Because you can say, okay, you have this foreign power which comes and rules us, right? We want self-government, self-determination. That's political sovereignty, right? What that looks like generally in the post-colonial context was, it was also popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty, I think, is very much, becomes very, very much a central element of anti-colonial movements for a very simple reason, right? Which is this, which is, uh, what is the colonial argument for why the British, let's say, in the case of India, why the British have to be in India, right? Because their argument is that Indians can't govern themselves. They don't necessarily have the political capacity, right? The maturity, they're too backward, they're advanced enough. They can't govern themselves. If we leave, they'll fight amongst each other, and they know they will kill each other, and they will just be, disorder. And so they don't have the necessary, ability to govern themselves. Against that, what is Congress and Gandhi saying? They're saying that no, we do, right? Look at us. We can have an organization. We can have these sort of disciplined sort of rallies and movements, and all of which tells you and shows you that we can govern ourselves. So leave our country, and we should govern ourselves based on popular sovereignty. So in other words, one side is saying the people, the Indian people can't govern themselves. Other side saying they can, and therefore they should be the real sovereigns, right? Not the British crown. And this is again very much a version of this you see in every other anti-colonial context, right? Because the empire always claims its power based on the lack of the people, ability of people to govern themselves. Therefore, the counterclaim has to be, it has to be popular sovereignty, right? So that's just kind of logically, it's the opposite of that. And that's been, so popular sovereignty becomes very much the basis on which almost all anti-colonial countries achieve their independence and write their constitutions. Even those that become, dictatorial authoritarian later on, right? Nevertheless, claim it on the name of the people still, right? They don't. No one says it's a name of a king, or that's only a few cases, like say Saudi Arabia or the Gulf countries, or in the case of Africa, you have some like Swaziland. A very, very few cases where basically sort of goes back to a king or a chief or a or a prince, right? It's mostly popular sovereignty. So that's one. The problem is this, though. Let's say today you're independent politically. That's the easier part, because you can sort of actually point that out in which point of time the British flag goes down, the Indian flag goes up in Lal Killa and so on, right? And then we are independent. The question is, are we economically independent still? And what does that mean? That means because colonialism was not just the fact of British coming and ruling India, the way we think of it, in this classic model of a British, bad British ruler coming and punishing Indians and saying, you can't, you see in the Hindi films this idea of the British, it was an economic system. It was a global economic system, much more significantly in some senses than just this political domination, because it was a very deep, spread out global economic system. And various ways, right? Ways in which industrial production work, the way resources were taken from the colonial world, the way of finances and money and debt work, and this is a very, very complicated sort of net, right? And why do you think Gandhi, along with Swaraj, also a Swadeshi movement, to build Indian industry, buy Indian goods, create an economy? So the question of economic independence was as important, in the anti-colonial movement as political independence. And in some ways, it's harder to get, because now you're not just talking about throwing away one sets of rulers and having just a new government, but really recreating an economic structure which has been in place for hundreds of years, right? Which is the imperial economic structure. You have to now create Indian industries. You have to create, Indian farms. Kind of remove India from this, deep kind of relationship with British banks and British industries and debt. The British own parts of our railways. The British own most of the companies in the managing structure, right? How do we open that up? How do we disentangle that? This is a problem India faces, but every single post-colonial country faces, and this always proves to be a larger and more difficult challenge, right? And part of this transformational constitutionalism question is also to therefore say that independence is not just political. We can't just stop with that. That's very important, extremely important. We can't just stop with that, but to go further, right? to gain some degree of economic independence. Otherwise, we'll still be in some senses answerable to, right, the European powers, because they still own most of the economic resources in our country, right? And part of the transformation of transformational constitutionalism was to gain economic independence as much as political independence, right? If that makes sense.
So again, when we talk about political independence, you mentioned, like just did, that the Indian Constitution and its leaders created mass movements and how those were depoliticized
Right,
to bring the constitutional ideals of the people out better than just the political ruling class. So in the second
right,
half of your book, you talk about the constituent administrator, which was a bureaucratic
right,
class that shaped how constitution and governance interplays with the local factors of the polity. So,
right.
when we talk about modern movements and especially movements regarding constitutional ideals like equality, like political
Mm-hmm.
freedom, like even corruption, since the 90s, how would you feel that this bureaucratic administrator has depoliticized mass movements and how it relates to the constitution in addition to the court's rule?
So it's not a 1950s kind of issue. I think that the issue is, I think, even going back further, right? That this is the main dilemma of the anti-colonial movement, which is this, right? If you know, the Indian anti-colonial movement began with a very small urban professional class. You think of late 1870s and 80s, right? It's the formation of the Congress and the various sabhas and so on, right? This is a class which you often call sort of the constitutional liberal class, right? They're asking for, this is the beginning of any kind of anti-colonial, modern anti-colonial movement, right? And they're asking for some rights in the empire. They're doing petitions. They don't really do mass movements. They don't really necessarily trust mass movements. And their idea is sort of, that if we kind of ask the British state nicely, they will give us a bit more rights and change some things. That doesn't happen to be the case. It's more or less, a failure in terms of, political cause. So then, after the First World War, with Gandhi, you start having a mass movement, right? That's a big, big change in the nature of anti-colonial movement, because now you're not just meeting amongst some small elites in these cities and writing petitions, but you're actually sort of mobilizing the masses. You're going on streets, doing huge rallies, sit-ins, dharnas, hartals, and so on, right? These are all mass political things. And Gandhi and Congress transformed itself from this party of small urban professionals to a enormous mass party, perhaps the largest mass party in the history of the world till then, right? In terms of, it's a huge organization, and it scans from like small villages all the way to the big city, right? That's the mass movement. Now, and that's successful. Because it's successful is why we have even the conversation about there being freedom. Like India, there's a misunderstanding that India often just got freedom because the British were like, too weak after the Second World War. No, because India became too ungovernable because the success of the Congress's mass movement, right? So that was the reason why they couldn't hold on to India anymore. Now, as they get too successful, right, there's a worry amongst a certain section of the Congress leadership, right, especially what's then called the Congress right. So people like, Bhagavatai Patel or Rajagopalachari or K.M. Munshi, that the mass movement is so successful that there's going to be too much of an unrest, right? And what happens with the mass movement is the demands of the masses are not just now limited to like, oh, remove the British. They now also want other things. They want economic justice, right? They want land. They want end of zamindari, right? They want end of like debt bondage. Like these are the kind of things they want, which goes way beyond what the Congress just wants to limit it to, which is just economic political independence, right? So that's the period when, led by the Congress, right? So people like Patel is perhaps the most important figure in this move. To move towards just the state, right? In other words, saying, forget the streets and mass movements. Let us get the independence and control this thing through within the state, within the government, right? And if you see, the last sort of 7 to 5 years of preceding independence, that's the move Congress basically makes. It tries less and less to be act like a mass party, which sort of does his dharnas and hartals and so on, and do more like negotiations, like become a government in waiting, train bureaucrats, create a ministry, right? Like work through the state rather than outside and against the state, which is the big, sort of duality, right? And once you do that, your main sort of actors now becomes the bureaucrats, administrators, right? And who were trained by the British government, obviously. India had a very, very well-trained cadre of bureaucrats, and because it's a large state, and India was a long tradition through the Indian civil service and other kinds of trained state officials. And those are the people Congress and again I said especially people like Patel now depend upon, right, to be the major figures of building a new India, right? So these are the technocrats and some of whom you know of as very important figures. People like say B.N. Rao, right? One of the most important figures in this moment of building a new India, a career bureaucrat, right? And many of them are like that. And that's the administrative I'm talking about, right? So in other words, as opposed to mass popular politics, which was to say like build a nation, and Gandhi has a version of that. Gandhian idea of constructive program is that, right? We kind of create new people, new idea of society through mass movement. And now you have we will do all of those things, but through a carefully planned technocratic administration, right? The planning commission is a version of that. Much of but it's very state centric, and the state will do these things, right? Which is the version we kind of get to know in India after independence, right? It becomes very much about the bureaucracy and the state as the most significant figure in any kind of this change. So again, I mean, we're talking about land reform earlier. You can do land reform through like mass movement. You can do land reform, as I said, mass peasant movement. And kind of what happens in India, in Kerala and West Bengal is a bit that you had through the Communist Party, masked cadre-based movements, which ends zamindari. But in most parts of India, places like Karnataka, UP, it's basically a bureaucrat-driven thing, right? You send these people, they do land, and that's the main way in which you think the transformational project will happen, right? So in other words, think about if you think who is the main sort of protagonist, right? Who, if you think of it as a Hindi film, like who's the hero of the transformational project? One version, it would have been popular movements, but the version which is adopted actually by the Congress and the Indian elites, independents, is the hero is a administrator, right, an officer. That can be bureaucrats, police officers, planners, but basically officers of the state.
So, in addition to this bureaucracy and technocracy debate, how would you feel that since globalization, neoliberal influences have impacted how the Indian state views its own bureaucrats, both as tools of its own
Right.
power as well as agents of constitutionalism?
This is a very good question. I think, and absolutely neoliberalism, it changes things very, very big, right? And of course, the book doesn't really come to that point necessarily. I'm still more focused in the 50s, and to the extent I look into the independent India, I go up to the 70s more or less. Then the 90s, neoliberalism is a bit far, but it's a very important thing to ask, right? Because in some ways it does and does not change. So the way it changes, I think, and then something I think today is very, very clear in India is that the main kind of the what we would call the professional class, which is often very much considered a part of not just the bureaucrats. We can think like sort of academics, journalists. This particular class was extremely significant and important during the independence. Right, this was the class which was this administrative class, which had this sort of nation-making vision, right? And they were, in some ways, a leading group in terms of national-making vision, right? And that has been, I think, replaced. And I'm being a bit simplistic here, but it's a more complicated story. But just for the sake of shorter conversation, they have more and been replaced by what you would call the capitalist industrialist class, right? And even most of these professionals now are not professionals in the state as administrative bureaucrats, but as corporate managers, right? So I think there's been a huge shift in that class and what even administration management means, because the state in some very significant areas, the state has withdrawn, right? And given up the space to what we'd say private capital, which was not the case during independence, and not just the case because of a good or bad thing. It's just Indian capital wasn't strong enough or big enough to any of those things. And so it was a very much state-driven process, where I think capital has taken over a lot of those parts. Now, however, does it mean the state has become smaller or less powerful? No, it's just the state does different things. The state now often aids in the functioning of capital, right? It sort of aids in the way businesses can function and sort of provide support for that, as opposed to something which stand apart from that and, in some forms even disciplines that, right? So it's a different relationship, especially to private capital, right? The landlordism thing is very different now. It's not the same as what it would have been then. It doesn't mean that there are not big landowners in the village. It's not the same thing at all. It's very, very different. But the huge distinction is the relationship of these bureaucrats, administrators as a class, what I call professional class in the book, with the capitalist class, right? And I think that was much more quite different. It was often they're not necessarily in service of the capitalist class, and they're often disciplined in some ways. Now they're much more in service of the capitalist class, which is the most powerful in some senses in its action. So that's, I think, a big shift in both the, what the administrators do, how they see themselves, their roles, right? And where are they in relationship to these other groups, I think, under neoliberalism. That's one thing. And what is done with constitutionalism, therefore, I think, this idea of a state-driven planned transformation, that idea was kind of, ran its course by the 80s, I would say, right? And I think there was an attempt to sort of retool Indian constitution from the 80s and 90s. At least, you can't really just rewrite. No one wrote the constitution. But we started thinking of the constitution in this much more traditional liberal American vein, which is where the constitution is really there to create some kind of, a stable, predictable structure for the functioning of capitalist economy, right? And that was the idea of, what was called the global constitutionalism movement, the rule of law movement, with the IMF and the World Bank and the UN sort of pushed the 90s and onwards. And the Indian constitution was often seen in that way, right? Though I think there's a problem with that, because that's not what it was originally. There was a kind of a massive sort of reimagining of that. Of course, the problem is it still doesn't look like that, right? Property is not an absolute right in India, and you have all these other balances. The state has its power, except we start imagining it like that, right? And that actually the Indian constitution is something like the American constitution. This creates a stable structure for the flow of the market and of private capital, right? So it became very much from a constitution, which is an instrument to create major social change, to an idea of constitution which is there to sort of stabilize and create modern market conditions, right? And that was the post-liberalization idea of what Indian economy is, and that's what the constitution is. But I think we keep having this conflicts and contradictions, because that's not how the constitution was designed initially, right? And that's why you keep having these moments where this new idea what the constitution is or what the constitution should do doesn't necessarily sit with the history of the constitution itself, because the project was so different after independence, right?
And would you say the same about the judiciary's role in solidifying, when you say that we now have a crazy stable structure about constitutionalism? Would you say the judiciary still plays the same active role, especially in the last 20 years, ever since we've had the NJAC fiasco?
So those are two different questions. I think I would say I don't think the constitution is a very stable structure in India. I think that's because of this, this contradiction between its own history and the way we think it should function today, right? So that's one thing. The judiciary is, I think there's two ways of thinking of judiciary, what it did, right? One is the judiciary has a much longer story of conflict with this idea of constitution. So this is why, and I tell the story in the chapter 8 of the book, which is on judiciary, which is to say that this idea of transformational constitutionalism, where constitution is about kind of an instrument for a state-driven, directed, planned social change, never sat well with the judiciary, and for this very simple reason, which is that such an idea of constitution really marginalizes lawyers and judiciary, the same class of people, right? Lawyers and judiciary from a major constitutional role, because the judiciary and lawyers like to believe, they often believe, and they teach you in law school, is that constitution is primarily a subject for us, right? We are the ones, lawyers and judges, who really understand what the Constitution is. The lay people outside don't understand what the Constitution is. We are the ones who understand what the Constitution is. We are the keepers of the Constitution, right? We are the true sort of interpreters of the Constitution. So if you want to talk about like constitutional politics, the constitutional life, that is really about the courts, right? That's where constitutional politics and life really unfolds. Outsiders don't really understand what the Constitution is. It's a legal document. It's for us to understand and determine and interpret, right? Now, a moment you say, no, Constitution is really about, facilitating social change by administrators, by planners, then you are a secondary actor, right? The main actors are planners, administrators, technocrats who were using the Constitution to create planned social change, right? And from the very beginning, when I was mentioned earlier, the land reform cases, is you see a conflict between that idea of Constitution, which is the idea of Constitution shared by Congress leaders, shared by the Assembly itself, I would argue, right? Which is Constitution as this vehicle of social change, and the lawyers' idea of Constitution, right? Which is what the courts bring. And there is for the very beginning, why do we have a First Amendment within the first year of the Constitution coming into place, right? For this reason. From the very beginning, the way these people think of Constitution and this new distinctive way, transformational constitutionalism, and the way judges think of Constitution, a much more traditional common law sense, drawn from the British experience, right? More than American, of a common law where the judges are the main actors, the most important actors, right? Versus the part where the administrators are more important actors. There's a conflict between these two things. And they're not necessarily, as I say, ideological conflicts. It's not really because someone's on the right, on the left. It's much more a conflict about, who is the most important figure, right? Judges or administrators. And it's sort of, kind of an institutional conflict, right? That's there from the very beginning. And I think much of the constitutional conflict, going all the way up to Keshwananda Bharati, right? Keshwananda Bharati, basically, judges are saying, we have the final say on what a constitution is, right? It's kind of a final, and the lead up to that, all the Goloknath cases, all these cases, all about land reform, by the way, right, are leading up to this main question, right? Are we the main actors or are you the main actors? These are the constitutional questions. That's a longer debate and battle, right? And I think the judges kind of win that by the 80s, that debate, as we know, right? Like the Keshwananda Bharati case, and then you don't really have these kind of battles come up again very much, and judges kind of win this battle of this final say on what constitutions are, right? And that I think I say it's around the same time we have the end of this transformational constitutional project. It's around the same time, right? So it's the same time when that defeats, judges kind of have the final say. And so that's this one story of the judiciary with the Constitution, which I tell in the book. The other question you're asking the judges in the last, say, 20 years, especially after liberalization, right? Liberalization is longer. That's more like 30 years, more or less. So, but after, let's say, even last 10, 15 years, I think the big distinction there has been, I think judges have, moved more towards what everybody can call this market-centered idea of law, rule of law, constitutionalism, and so on, right? I think that people have made that case, and you can see that through many of these cases. But on the other hand, there's been another interesting way the judges haven't asserted themselves, which is, I think in the question of civil and political rights, which is it's a new, interesting for other kind of reasons, which is not necessarily the topic of the book. But I think that's one place where judges actually always had the space to assert themselves, right? Even under transformational constitutionalism, you can always sort of, do the civil and political rights stuff. And that they have done less and less so, I think, in the last 10, 15 years. And that's a different kind of problem.
And at the same time, when we talk about our own constitutional journey, would you say that India's constitution has impacted other post-colonial nations as well in the aspect of having a bloodless and a legal revolution?
Yes, I think that's very much the case. And this is, again, not a question of opinion. You have a lot of these, because India was, a couple of things. One is about timing. India was one of the earlier countries in the, if you look at the independence sort of countries began in 1945 or so. And in India is 47, and of course the independence goes in 1960, 62 with all the African countries getting independence, right? And then there's some which happened in the 70s, but more or less till 62, 3 we have. So India is early on. So there's a kind of a way in India is a pioneer in some senses. India has two other kind of advantage why it is so influential. One is because the Congress and the independence movement itself was seen as like the sort of, exemplary idea of anti-colonial movement, right? And it remains, because it was the biggest mass movement, the most organized party of anti-colonial struggle. It never really compromised with the British much, right? So it was people across the anti-colonial struggle looked up to the Congress as a model of how to do a successful anti-colonial movement, right? So India was already a model even before the constitution. So that's one. And the third thing is, India is, again, because of its size and because of Congress's own strength, Indian constitution was very much an independent process. Like, the British had no say in it whatsoever, right? That's not the case in most cases. In many anti-colonial, in many post-colonial context, the departing colonizing power had a big say on the constitution which has been written in some way or the other, right? You see that across Africa very much so, where British or the French are departing, nevertheless, influences the process massively. Or the Cold War, Soviet Union or United States influencing from outside, right? India is one of the cases where India actually writes their constitution without any foreign influence of the British or the US or the USSR, none of these things. To the extent Indians look at other constitutions, which they do, there was a B.N. Rao who goes around, looked at American, Irish, other models. They do it on their own terms. No one forces them to. So India, therefore, becomes, a case of a post-colonial constitution written entirely by Indians themselves, autonomously, after a successful movement with a very mass organized party at an early stage of decolonization. So for all of these reasons, right, India is seen as, by many, as the exemplary post-colonial constitution, and has had a major legacy in that sense across the post-colonial world for that reason. And a second is, and the other point, which I think you mentioned very correctly, is because that ambition of having, a revolutionary change without the revolutionary trouble, right, is shared by many post-colonial elites. You have a similar attempt, for example, in countries like Egypt, like Ghana, like Indonesia. Like, these are all, the countries which are big enough to do that. So you have one model of anti-colonial struggle, like, say, China and Vietnam and Algeria, which is about armed revolutions. That's one model. And the other model, which is more about a peaceful transition, India is like the exemplary version of that, right? And that ambition is shared by many countries. So, the three I mentioned, Ghana, Egypt, and Indonesia, are the three most well-known examples of that. But you can think of many others, the countries like, say, Senegal, or later on in the Caribbean, right? They have this similar ambition. And so that project is quite same, which is why the constitutional questions are often quite similar.
So when we go and compare how this bloodless revolution aspect has come up again and again in your book, and as well as in India's
Right.
constitutional journey, would you say that attempts to undo revolutions in other countries were taken care of and were somewhat foresought by our own constitutional leaders, which is why we didn't see our own constitutional failing or attempts to be made to undo the constitution?
You mean in terms of coups and stuff afterward?
In coups as well as obedience to the constitution? What brings
Right.
the Indian constitutional spirit out?
Right. No, that's actually a very good question, I think. And because I think something we often don't remember enough, that India is exemplary is in one of the very, very few post-colonial countries, if not the only one, where there hasn't been a military, I know emergency is not really a coup, and that also was quite short-lived compared to other countries. India didn't really have, a military dictatorship or coup or something of kind which overthrows the constitutional structure. We still have, with no matter how many amendments to it, a very same almost constitution, right? It is the longest lasting post-colonial constitution because it looks pretty much the same from the beginning. With the how many amendments, is the basic structure remains more or less the same. So that's quite a remarkable thing. And you're right. The questions to ask has to be answered. Therefore, why not in India? I think part of it is to do with the constitution itself, and I think that's sort of an answer, because the constitution kind of understood that it can't be inflexible. It can't just say order and that's it. It has to understand that there is all these sources of unrest, all these ambitions, aspirations which are unfulfilled. It has to be flexible enough. So I have this quote, by the assembly, which someone says that it has to bend or it will break, right? It has to kind of Because it's a complicated situation, we cannot just impose one thing. And I think the constitutional model allowed for that kind of space. That's absolutely correct. But I think some of the answers about India's longevity and stability are not just to do with the constitution. They do with two other very important things. One is, as I said, I think the exemplary success of the Congress in being a mass party and a party of all classes, right? Congress is a party, and you can take a very good example as a comparison with something like Kuomintang in China, the Chiang Kai-shek's China, which is that it tried to be, kind of suppress this side, that side, and then it was itself blown out in revolution, right? Congress was actually able to make space for all parties, and in a country as complex as India, as big as India, this is the an extraordinary success of someone like a Gandhi and a Congress that would be able to have space from the biggest industrialists like Birla to the smallest peasants, right? And find some kind of a way of accommodating all sides and not like directly repressing anybody or the other, right? Straightforwardly. And because, that sort of thing creates its own kind of problem, both regionally or in terms of class, right? It tried to at least, look, and even if people know, yes, Congress eventually was an upper caste Hindu, party. Nevertheless, it was open to the idea that we have to have a larger accommodation. I think which gave it, an extraordinary stability. I think, and I think gave India extraordinary stability, and that and Congress never, because it was such a popular party, successful party. Congress itself did not not require to go to the army, or to stabilize its role. It actually won elections. It really did won elections on its own terms, right? At least when Nehru was still there. And then even then, when it's fractured, it still does in a way in which, you don't need the army to come and help you out, right? So I think that's a very important one. I think that the role of the Congress as a mass party and the way it was able to do that. And I think how it was able to sort of, coordinate, because if you think about it, and maybe this is important, we don't always acknowledge as Indians. India is a continent, right? It's an enormously, there's no other country in the world like that. It's not just it's large, it has all these different regions with different histories, languages, and the fact it remains together is an extraordinary achievement, in fact, right? And which is it's not normal. And that required very, very enormous levels of political skills, which I think Congress did show, which is why I think we shouldn't take for granted that India will remain together forever, because it shouldn't. And it required a very, very kind of, accommodative, expansive, very politically skilled kind of structure, which allowed for all different sides to speak. I think that also helps us think about the stability of India as a polity beyond just the constitution. It's not just the constitution. I think it's the structure and political system, which is built through the anti-colonial movement and then sustained after that by these different parts and classes.
So, this is one observation I've made, which many first generation constitutional scholars often make. One criticism
Right.
of the Indian constitution and of the common populace is that there is a general stereotype about brown rulers replacing white rulers post 1947.
Right.
There is a
Right.
stereotype that there was no exact conception of freedom, and that the
Right.
only change we did have was self rule instead of foreign rule. So,
Right.
many second generation constitutional scholars, as well as academic writers, point out that despite lack of literacy on a huge scale during the first 10 15 years when constitution
Mm-hmm.
making was at its peak, we still
Mm-hmm.
were able to cultivate the appeal of a against to work against a unitarian party format, because as you
Yeah.
would remark that the Congress party had created a stage where all members of society could come up.
Right.
So,
Right.
how would you defend this criticism against how constitutionalism has developed? The said criticism being literacy and the stereotype of brown rulers replacing white rulers.
Right. So, I think it is not an either or issue, right? And there is a way in which you can argue, people have argued that the independence did not change enough. I think that's a fair point. It didn't, right? Like there are a lot of people who remain powerful, because this is a reason why. I think this is important. It's not and I think often in India today, as you know better than I do, debates become what Congress good or bad, Nehru was good or bad, and those are silly debates. Those are not, they're not serious debates. Serious debates should be this, which is that Because colonial rule didn't just act, because we often don't think of colonial rule just as these like British officers in Delhi, like being cruel to Indians everywhere else. Colonial rule, as said, was an economic system. Many people in the economic systems were Indians themselves. You can think of the Indian princes, the Indian landlords. So these were all close to and supportive of the British rulers, right? These are Indians. So a lot of Indians did the work of colonial rule in terms of as part of the economic system. All the Indian business houses, right, which we today think of as nationalist business houses, the Tatas, the Birlas, did made their money doing business with the British, right? So when you have independence, right, these people are still all there. They're still all powerful. The princes remained all powerful. The princes were the number one supporters of British, right? All the Scindias and they basically become, change themselves to parliamentary rulers. The big landlords become, local notables and again parliamentary figures, right? Powerful figures politically. So a lot of the power structures did not change enough. This is an important thing to remember, right? So I think that, so often when people say brown rulers with white rulers, that's a simplistic way of saying that we thought that independence would be a much, much bigger change, right? Will
A
be much more
utopia,
revolutionary change. Sorry?
as many would say, a utopia.
Exactly. But if Ethiopia or not, I think there's a ways you can think across the world, there are more or less changes. I think in India was somewhere in the middle. It was not as continuous as many other countries, but it not there are countries which actually had huge changes after the independence, right? Again, I mentioned like Vietnam, Algeria, and so on. Now, so that is a fair point to make, right? That did not happen. And many of these people who were very close to the British, they just became part of the new government, just seamlessly almost, right? On the other hand, nevertheless, I think the point which is important to remember about India, against that. So that's why this kind of simplistic binary Congress good or bad is not useful, which is that Congress was truly a mass party in a way there never has been another one in Indian history, right? Even like today, because it was not mass party in a way that was electorally successful. Because today we think of mass party, can they get that many percentage of votes, right? Congress did. They were very successful electorally. That's not only with their mass party. They had organization at every local level, right? They could actually think of something like Quit India, where literally the Congress leaders give one call for a mass movement. They're all jailed next day, immediately. And yet the entire country erupts. Like that's how strong Congress's popularity and appeal was, right? And that's a genuine thing. It's a genuine thing. I think it's very wrong to think of Congress as people who were just like doing deals with the British. They were not. They were genuine things. That all leaders have gone to jail themselves, right? They were mass leaders. And what that meant was that even if everything else, a lot of the things remain the same, right? Democracy in India was not, fiction. It's a real thing, right? There were people who were, as you said, people who were not literate, right? Who could not necessarily understood what politics is, understood what Congress is. They went to go give votes. They understood their interest. And even in India today, you talk about how the population, even if they're often, don't have the best literacy, have a sophisticated understanding of politics and interests, right? Like they understand, they're not fools. They don't necessarily can be swayed easily this way or that way, right? And I think often elites often think of the population that way. I think it's a wrong way to think about it. I think there are quite a sophisticated, quite a ground, and because it's a long cultivated practice, which goes from before independence, goes from the Gandhian movement. The Gandhian movement politicized these people. They brought them onto streets. They talked about politics amongst others in their villages. There's all these great novels from the period I was talking about 30s onwards. If you read, as I said, Premchand is a good example for those who read Hindi. There are discussions within villages among peasants, with the local leaders about politics. The people are politicized, right? And that's a real achievement of the Indian nationalist movement, which I think, and what that meant was that it was never exactly the same. It couldn't be the same because now you have democracy, now you have elections, now people know that they have some kind of voice, right? They have some sort of power. And even if those exercise of voice and power is deeply curtailed by a very hierarchical system, very unequal system, where some have enormous money and power and some very little, right? It does still exist in some form. And you see that happen again to again, like the anti-emergency movements are very important, or the Jayaprakash Narayan movement, right? Where, you can mobilize against a very powerful state, right, through these calls and those movements happen in one of the poorest parts of India, in Bihar and UP, right? That's where the JP movement is powerful. So you get these different examples where there is quite a significant distinction, I think, in terms of what democracy in India achieved, I think, and which I think is more than almost anywhere else in the post-colonial world, right, in terms of its achievement. And that's not just because the constitution is stable. It's because there is a genuine sort of democratic contestation, competition. You can see that, right, which happens in India. So I think that would be my argument to say it's not that one or the other side is good. One side says, oh, nothing happened, it's just the same as bad. The other side says, oh, we got full freedom, everything is great, right? It's not that those two things are always generally never are right answers. The answers always somewhere a bit more complicated. And the complicated answer would be that I think there was not enough change. People had hoped for more change. People were promised more change. Even if Congress manifestos promised much more change than what happened, especially in socioeconomic categories, right, in terms of socioeconomic power. But democracy was in India still a real thing. I think it's an extraordinary achievement. And Congress's anti-colonial movement was a real popular movement, and it was a real popular party in that sense.
So, while that would be all for the book, one more question which I did have in mind for you was,
Of
if
course.
you could go back to the Constitutional Assembly debates surrounding this time,
Right. Right.
which debate and which aspect would you like A was to more would be more touched upon, and B would have received more emphasis from the people themselves rather than the Constitutional Assembly?
Right.
What?
It's a very good question. I think it's a very, very good question. I think I'll give you two answers to it. One in terms of the process, and one in terms of actual, substance. So in terms of process, I think, and this is what I make the main argument in the book, is I think the process, I wish it drew more from popular politics. In other words, anti-colonial movement, like I said several times today, was a very popular movement. Congress is a very popular party. There are a lot of, and during the assembly, when they're meeting those 3-4 years, right, there's a lot of popular political activity going outside. You have these huge strikes, you have these peasant rebellions and student movements, and the assembly doesn't really kind of separate themselves from it rather than go and draw from it. You can draw from it in different ways. You can do it institutionally. You can draw from it in terms of a referendum or actually public discussions or public forums. None of which they do, right? They actually try to sort of set this apart. I think that they did that. I wish that there could have been it would have been more of a popular sort of constitution form, right? Than as the version we get. I think that would have itself, that process might have changed many actual substantive things in the constitution, right? That's one thing. And in terms of substance, the two things I wish there was different. One is the thing about repression. I think the constitution preserves and legitimizes some colonial forms of state repression, right? Which I wish wasn't the case. I think that has had its long life. Even today in India, from those very days, all the way up to date was Pota and Tada and all of these things, right? Where the state has this tremendous discretionary power to repress citizens, right? They arrest them, I think those, I hope they were better, and those come from a colonial practice, right? Preventive detention, pre-trial detentions, they're all colonial things, right? And I wish there were better remedies against that. And because, that's part of being a democracy, allowing for political dissent and political movements, and challenge the states. I wish that's one thing the constitution makers did not. So that I write about that in one of the chapters, as you know, and in terms of which I, critique. That's one very big thing. Another big thing, and for me, was fundamental, is in terms of the property question. I think there was ways in which, if land reform could have been made more successful in the constitution by giving it more, and another simple thing about just one particular provision or not. I think Ambedkar had a couple of very good suggestions about sort of changing the land structure, which was not taken seriously by the Congress. But I think that would have changed a lot. Because I think the large landlord class plays a very, very negative role in India's political life afterwards. And I think there was a chance then to substantially deal with that problem and have a more equitable land system, which I think would have had a very different outcome afterwards.
So that would be all, Sandipto. Thank you so much for
Thank you
coming
very
back.
much. Thank you for
We
Thank you
would
for having me on. Thank you.
certainly, we are axes of difference. We are a different section of LSPR. We specifically deal with questions of caste class and how the constitution has developed. Thank you so much for coming to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.